Oh no, I see it. Come on, let's go. Come on. All right, we're gonna find this thing. Wait a minute, you're kidding me. We got it. For real, we are painting this massive Timberwolf now. So if you're ready, join me on the painted Topher. Let's get painting this Timberwolf. Welcome back. I gotta admit, this is going to be a long video. We got 30 minutes. So you can actually use the sponge to do base coating. Now, I'm using the charred brown from Vallejo, and I'll be honest, it didn't work out too well with basing with this. But if you're working with a smaller mini, certainly this could be done. But just for in this case, it just wasn't working. You can add a little bit more water to the sponge to do base coating, but it just wasn't working. So I went ahead and jumped to this tank brush. This thing is like 20 years old. I got this when I was a kid, and I still have it. Now, when I'm basing with this big brush, like these kind of bubbles appear, it's just because the whole thing is like the paint's watered down a bit, so it kind of made me a little fearful for a little bit, but it is all good. The paint is nicely watered down. Now, as normal, I'm aiming to do 2 coats with this because you don't want to mess up at this stage, and if even you need to do, you could do 3 coats at this point. But man, this model is massive. Like, I have so much painting to do. But here we go. 1 coat's done. Let's get to the 2nd coat. So here we go. 2 coats applied. So I'm gonna mix this wasteland clay and back to that brown for my first coat. Now, my coverage here, I would say I'm trying to cover 90%. I'm almost to 100%. I just want to cover up the majority of the panels while leaving the brown recesses. And what's really good about this model is that the recesses are super deep. So you could easily pin wash this, but I'm doing it my method. And also typically, I like to leave the undertones of the shades a lot more prominent. But since this is a bigger model kind of on display, I am going to go ahead and cover up everything but the recesses with this base coat, the wasteland clay and the brown mix. And if I haven't spoken about this in other videos, make sure that your sponge when you're doing this method is that it's a little damp. You don't want it drenched in wetness, and it helps also just to have it a little damp. And try to get these little mini brushes. They are amazing. So I'm switching to this mini sponge just so I can cover up all those details underneath the guns, underneath that cockpit area, and all those nooks and crannies. Next, I'm going to use the Wasteland Clay from War Paints, and now my goal is to cover up 80% of the mini. So I want to leave that previous coat underneath the guns, underneath the cockpits, underneath kind of like where the shadows would be picked up. And my goal is to cover up all the upper parts of the mech while trying to leave some of the shadow tones underneath. Now, granted, I will go back later and make more shadow tones, but it's always nice to build up the shadow tones from the beginning. Now, this model, you can also do a little bit of brush ons. If you looked at that previous video I did about the locust, the first mini you painted, and I kind of like used the makeup sponge to brush rather than dabbing, you could do that because that gives you a little bit more smoother application. But In this case, I'm using the dabbing motion and just trying to get it covered up. And I'm switching again back to that mini brush. Even though if I use just that mini brush, it would take forever to do this, but I really have to get those small recesses underneath. And you could also cut off pieces of the larger sponge if you're trying to do this part, but hey, it's working the way it is with this mini sponge. And also, if you're working with other models the normal size, you definitely want to get one of these. Now, I'm painting this for a commission for someone, and I really don't know the lore of this unit. I like to share lore as I'm painting. I know nothing about that, but what I can share is that I first got into BattleTech with those Whiz Kids Clicks game. I got the Timberwolf in one of those blind boxes. It was one of this like tundra winter themed, and I love that thing. I won some tournaments and it was amazing with that thing. So yeah, that was my first experience with BattleTech. Next, I'm going to use the Wasteland Clay mixed with the Barren Dune 50/50. Now, I'm aiming now this point 60% of coverage because now we're moving to a lighter tone because that previous base really built up that yellowish kind of tan color. Now we want to start building up to the lighter tones while leaving some of those other colors underneath. And what's cool about working with this large model, I have so much space to work with. Sometimes with those light mechs or the medium mechs, you really are constrained to how much space you have to build up these colors. And finally, there's so much to do and so much area to work up and do these different colors. Now, when you're working with like that curved surface, as you see with the leg there, you can build up to the top because I feel like when you have those kind of curved surfaces, it's a bit daunting, especially if you're going to think about doing edge highlights or that just panel line shading. And what the sponge kind of gives you that ability to build up from the shading highlights from down and going up. Because if you were going to do just the panel washing method and layering, it might be a little bit challenging to build up those highlights on curved surfaces. Now I'm going to use the Barren Dune itself, and now I'm aiming for like 40 to 50% coverage, I would say. More like 40, because I will do a next shade with this mixed with off-white. And I will say I'm going to be doing weathering and shading more. So right now the model looks very clean, but I really want to dirty this thing up and make it look a little bit more banged up. And I should add, when you're working with lighter colors with the sponge, you want to make sure that you do have enough dampness on the sponge because you will get some like graininess. So if you don't want the graininess, try to keep the sponge decently moist and do lighter coats. If you try overdoing it too quickly, you will get the grain stuff. So next I'm going to do 50/50 of the Wasteland Clay mixed with off-white. Now I'm really just focusing on those edges. I'm not going to hit the center of the panels, just the edges, and the only center of the panel I'll do is on top of the cockpit because I want to put the highlight in the center of it. But the rest of them I'm just focusing on the top 10%, and I'm kind of letting the light, I have a light above me, so if you're painting this style, kind of judge where the light is hitting. I have two lights above me, so it helps to kind of show where to put the highlights. And then if in doubt, just use another light source above. So I'm going to use this Basilisk Red, and this clan uses this tan and red kind of scheme. And the red is dark, so I want this dark red to be the majority that is seen. I don't want to move to an orangey red this time. I just want it to stay pretty dark. Now, covering this, I have the base of this red decently. I have some water mixed into it because you could streak it. When you're dealing with larger surfaces like this and you're using a brush to stroke, you have to be careful that your paint has enough water in it so it flows good on the panels, or you will get streaks. So there's many good examples online of other YouTube videos about thinning your paints, and this is a good example that when you have large surfaces, make sure you thin your paints with enough water. In To be honest, if you were to make a mistake here, it might be challenging to cover up. I will have some mistakes later with the red hitting the tan, and I had to glaze the tan over it. But when you're dealing with a lighter color and a darker color, it's best to be careful, but it is fixable if you were to make a mistake. And if you do make a mistake, really take the time to fix it, because it really stands out if you make a accidentally hit on the tan. I think I actually I made a mistake with the red and I used it as weathering. I put some black over and scratched, so you could also do that. So the first step of weathering, I'm going to use this AK Old Rust and then that brown wash mix 50-50. I'm going to mix it with decent amounts of white spirit and cover this whole thing up. It looked really clean, like too clean. So my goal for this enamel wash is to give some dirtiness on the under parts of the mech, and then it's also going to kind of lighten up some of the darkness in the other recesses. But this thing, I had to let it dry overnight. It just took a while, and I am going to use the white spirits on a sponge and just clean up some of this enamel wash. And if you're cleaning up with a sponge, you can dab and take it off, and you're not gonna have issues with the paint coming off. I've been doing this now for a while now, doing this method, and I have not once had the paint come off. Now I'm going to go back to that barren dune and try to build up some of the highlights. In this case, I'm aiming just to hitting on those edges and recesses just to bring out a little bit more of the color if some of the color was lost when I did the wash. So you can see there on the leg some of the wash that's still there, the enamel wash, and just different areas. But in this case, I want to build up a little more of the brightness that was lost on the top edges of this Timberwolf Mad Cats. And this begs the question, do you prefer the name Timberwolf or Mad Cat? Let me know. I'm going to use the off-white now on the sponge, and just as you see, I'm kind of hitting on just the edges. I'm treating it kind of like an edge highlight, but on those curved recesses, because the sponge has dampness to it, I'm able to blend it with the previous colors. So if you're trying to blend a bright color with the sponge, make sure it has enough dampness. And as you see on the top of the cockpit, there was a little bit of a transition from the center of it moving to the edges where the white kind of stands out. Now I'm going to use this Vallejo metallic color. I am supposed to return my War Paints metallic paint because I think mine was defective, but this is my only metallic that's not dried up, so I'm using it. I will be buying some of those fancy Vallejo metallics very soon. But picking out the metal parts on this, I just had to look at some reference material on camo specs, and I am just basing all the areas that I believe should be metallic down on this timber cat. Okay, the time has come to do edge highlights. So when I'm approaching edge highlights, especially with a large model, I like to focus on each section as I go. So I'm focusing right now on this top panel of the missile pod section. Then I'll go to the other side. So I kind of like go, I'm going to work on the missiles here, and then I'll go to the other missile section. Then I'll work on the right arm, then the left arm, then the middle cockpit, then the left leg, then the right leg. The only reason I do that is just to keep myself from going crazy. I like to see the progress as I go, and I don't want to get confused. But I'm doing this as I do any edge highlight. This first edge highlight, since it's just 50-50 of the Baron Dune and the off-white, it's not going to stand out too much because it's close to my final sponge edge highlights, but it will help those recess or those some of the edges there, as you see on the gun here, some of those places that really needed a highlight. And I'm going to now use the sponge with the white to do my last highlight, and this has very little paint on it, so I can kind of blend and then rub it on the edges to create some cool white transitional highlights. And man, this is going to be 30 minutes of me talking. This is a lot. This is a big project. But I'm going to use the brush here and hit with just the side of the brush to hit some of the whites here. And this is just like the very tops, maybe like 20% of the edges here are being hit with that white, but making sure I use the edge of the brush, and I'm coming back and forth to the paint. I don't overload the brush, as you see is like the front part of it. So this is where I'm talking about adding the shading. So I'm going to do the Wasteland Clay mixed with the Leather Brown from Vallejo, and I'm using this like sponge, and I'm using this as another shade. I'm kind of like, it's not weathering, but I'm trying to use this sponge to go underneath, and I'm moving to the charred brown because I want it even darker. I realized I wanted to go even a little bit more, and I found out I wasn't fully liking using this sponge, so I switched to my makeup sponge to work on the curved edges. But many people mentioned that they really liked the Phoenix Hawk I did in that video a couple weeks ago, and this is the same idea, a lighter color, then using dark and doing another shade. And this is how I achieved that really cool shading on the, are those calf, I'm just gonna call them the calf muscles of the Mad Cat, but that's how I got that nice shading. I came back in and did a second shading with the makeup sponges, and it really helped. And it helps if you messed up your shading previously, that you can come back and do another shade. Now, like everything, man, now I gotta do the washing on this thing. And I put my wash on the wet palette and I add a little bit of water to it because I don't like the way washes look if they pull, and you can prevent pulling if you just add a little bit of water to the wash. And I'm really liking this dark tone from War Paints. So let's highlight the reds. So I'm doing Basilisk red mixed with pure red, and I'm hitting the top 20% of these panels because I want them to still be dark, but I need to build up a little bit of a highlight. And this is the case where I do hit a little bit of the tan with the sponge. So there's a couple areas I just wasn't careful enough. Now, I covered some of them up with glazing of the tan, but then others I used, I think I chipped and I just covered them up. So I am using now the pure red by itself and hitting the very top 10% of all these panels. So just wanted to do a kind of a the volumetric highlighting because I didn't do that yet for it. Whew. Now edge highlighting. The edge highlighting here, I'm using 50/50 of the Basilisk Red and the Pure Red and just hitting those edges. And in this case, I do hit a lot of the corners and the edges more than I typically do, just to make them pop a little bit more. And this really is the only highlight I'm doing on the red because I don't want them to be too crazy. Um, I don't want to add the orange to it. You could add the orange, but I really want it to stay dark. Now the cockpit. So I'm mixing this deep azure mixed with, how you don't have to say azure. That's a funny word. I'm mixing it with black from the AK rubber black and 50/50 with that. And just, this is decently, there's water added to it, just to let it flow well inside. And this is my first dark base for the cockpits. Now I'm using the deep azure. Man, someone's gonna get me on this pronunciation. You guys always hear my pronunciation wrong. um, I'm doing the typical jeweled method for this, so hitting in that diagonal shape, but I really want to blend this because those are some sharp edges. So I'm going to mix the previous tone, that previous dark color, and feather in and blend that together. And feathering is you kind of, I don't know, you hit it with the brush right there on that sharp edge and you help blend it together. We'll talk about feathering more deeper later. If you have questions, feel free to ask. So now I'm mixing the deep azure mixed with the turquoise siren, and I'm going to hit the bottom parts of the cockpit and then those kind of lines. And finally, the last bit is the aquamarine on the very edges. So now I have a second. So feathering, you use the water a little bit like a glaze in a way, and you kind of like, it's not like chipping, but you're pushing the brush towards the darker areas when you're trying to clean up the line. We'll talk about that later. So I'm mixing the violet Vallejo with the turquoise base and treating this as a glaze on the top left. And now I want the darker to be to the left, so I push that color to the top left there because I don't want it to mess up with the other blue colors. So if you're doing a glaze, you can kind of push the direction where you want it to go. And finally, I'm not doing that dots, but I'm dotting with the makeup sponge with aquamarine very carefully. And then I am going to come in with a mix of aquamarine mixed with off-white and do this kind of cool glare. And I think this is cool. I like this a lot more than that white dot. So let me know, what do you think about this style of cockpit over the typical white dots? Now, for the highlighting of the metals, I'm using Vallejo Oily Seal, and I'm using the sponge. And I don't mind if this hits a little bit of tan because it looks a little bit like scratches. So I actually think I hit some of the tan on purpose. Now, I'm using the off-white to pick out the missiles. Frankly, I did not know what color to do them, and I just chose white because I thought it looked interesting. Now I want to push this weathering a little bit more, so I'm using this dark gray filter. So filters, the way you use them, you lightly take a brush and kind of do a very light brush of the darker areas. This is a kind of easy way to do weathering. I want to buy more filters because they are really cool. You're just being really careful. I think whenever time I get the filter on my brush, I try to rub off a little bit on the side of the pot there or on a paper, and just kind of glazing it on and on the under parts of the mech because I don't want to mess up those previous highlights. But hey, this weathering is looking cool. This is a cool method. I'm going to keep using filters because this is a really effective way of doing quick weathering. Next, I'm going to use that little sponge again and do black chips. And when you're doing this method, make sure you get off a lot of the paint on a paper, and there's just a little bit left, and you can test it until see just the last little bit of paint is still on that sponge. I also wanted to do these rusted spots. So I found some just different areas to put black paint down, and this is the AK rubber black. And I just kind of made these little blocked out triangles or sections, and then I will use the rust red here in a bit. But before I do that, I want to use just the oily steel and scratch up. Just do some little scratches. I Granted, I could have gone more with these scratches, but I feel like my weathering and scratching was kind of minimalistic here, but maybe in the future I would do it more heavily. So I lost my recording when I did the rust red. So I take the rust red and I dab it on the areas where I want. Then I come back after it dried and I used another brush with just white spirit and I streaked it down. My filming got lost and I'm sorry, but as you see, there's kind of streaks going down, and I kind of show you here a little streak. I don't know what happened. I feel like every video I record, I always have one missed record, but this was the case, and I think this really looked good. I'll try this more in the future. So next, I want to work on the lasers. So I use Emerald Forest from War Paints on both lasers. And then I take the leafy green and I'm doing just a small edge on the bottom right. This is kind of that typical jeweled laser color. And it's like you're doing it in the bottom right half. And then I'll take Rainforest and go even smaller on top of that. And with this big mech, you have a lot of space to work with, so it's kind of cool. And finally, off-white and just doing a little dab of white for the jeweled. And I'm taking the Rainforest and glazing the edges just to kind of give it a little bit of a glow. So for the blue, I'm using Vallejo medium blue and going to cover the whole laser, then use the light turquoise from Vallejo and do the same thing, 20% down on the bottom right. And I'll go back to that Warpaint's aquamarine not mixed with off-white, it's just the aquamarine. And then I'll do the one dot in the center. And I'll glaze the aquamarine on the edges to give a little bit of a glow. Whew, this mech was a lot of work. With the varnish done, now I'm going to do the basing as a separate video this week. This has been way too long, 30 minutes. If you're still watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know, did you like this weathering technique, and do you want me to paint another one of these? Someone has offered to sell me one. This was for commission, but let's see. Nonetheless, thank you so much for watching to the very end of this video. Have an amazing day, and thank you so much for checking out this video. See you later.